My granddaughter always thought the trunk under my bed was just full of mothballs and old blankets. No one ever asked about it, not really. They saw the corner of dark wood peeking out from under the bed skirt, noticed the brass latch gone dull with years, and then went back to their phones, their rush, their lives. Tonight is different. Tonight, the house is quiet in a way that feels like an ending, not a pause. The clock in the hallway sounds louder. The street outside is almost empty. And there's this heaviness in my chest that the doctor gave a name to this morning, a name that means, not much longer. So, tonight, I am finally going to pull out the old wooden trunk under my bed, open it, and tell you every story behind what's inside, every love letter, every tiny shoe, every faded dress, and one secret I have never shared with anyone before. Do you ever feel time pressing on your shoulders, like a hand that's suddenly grown heavy? I bend down slowly, my knees complaining like old friends who have told me the same joke too many times. My fingers find the cool edge of the trunk that has slept in the dust for decades. You'd be surprised how heavy memories feel when you have to drag them into the light. The trunk scrapes against the floorboards with a long, tired sound. Dust rises in the air, catching the light like tiny ghosts, and for a second I almost see my own younger hands instead of these wrinkled ones. This trunk has traveled with me from house to house, room to room, like a quiet shadow. When my husband died, people asked if I wanted to throw anything out. Start fresh, they said. I shook my head, patted this old box, and told them, some things you carry until you can't anymore. They thought I meant blankets and photo albums. I meant regrets. My fingers hover over the latch. It sticks at first, as if even the metal is reluctant to remember. With a little coaxing, a press of an old butter knife, it gives way. Before I lift the lid, I want to tell you why tonight. Why not last year, or 10 years ago, or the night I first put this trunk under my bed and promised myself, someday. The truth is, someday always sounds safer than tonight, until you run out of nights. This morning, the doctor folded his hands and smiled that careful, practiced smile. He talked in gentle circles, about wear and tear, about the heart doing its best for a very long time, about options and comfort. I watched his mouth move and only heard one sentence. You should start putting your affairs in order. Affairs. As if my whole life could be stacked into neat piles of paper on a lawyer's desk. But this trunk under my bed, that is where the real affairs live. The affairs of the heart. The choices I made and the ones that were made for me. The good, the bad, and the one memory I have never dared to say aloud. So, I decided, before my heart gives up its secrets on a hospital bed, I will give them up here, with my own voice. Because there is something in this trunk that might change how you see me forever. Are you ready to see your grandmother not as a grandmother, but as a girl who once stood at a crossroads? I lift the lid. The smell comes first. Old paper and dried lavender. A hint of cedar, warm and soft. And that other scent, the one no one bottles, time itself. Inside, everything is layered like sediment at the bottom of a river. Years piled on years, colors fading from the top down. There's the folded quilt my mother stitched, a stack of envelopes tied with a blue ribbon, a pair of tiny shoes no bigger than my palm, a dress the color of rain-soaked earth, and something wrapped in brown paper at the very bottom, where the light doesn't quite reach. We won't go there yet. Not to the bottom. Not to the secret. Stories, like houses, must be entered through the front door. So we'll start near the top. With the letters. I pick up the stack, and the ribbon, once bright, now looks like a sky after a storm, tired, but still holding. The envelopes crackle a little in my hands. I run my thumb along the edge of the top one and see his handwriting again. Joseph. Not Grandpa. Not yet. Just Joseph. Have you ever held a version of someone that existed before you did? When I met Joseph, I was 19, working behind the counter of a bakery that smelled like sugar and burnt coffee. The world was smaller then, and slower, and full of noises we don't really hear anymore, the clatter of coins, the rustle of newspaper pages, the squeak of the bakery door that never quite closed right. He came in on a Tuesday. I remember because the Tuesday batch of rolls was always a little overcooked, and I was embarrassed as I stacked them in the basket. He wore a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled up, dark hair flattened on one side like he had slept wrong. He ordered a black coffee and 2 cinnamon rolls and then, instead of leaving, he sat at the corner table and took out a small notebook. Every few minutes he looked up, not at me, I told myself, but at the clock over my head. Of course, it was me. I didn't know then that this man with ink on his fingers would write me almost 100 letters. That his words would outlive his voice. It took him 4 visits to say more than thank you. On the 5th, his courage arrived 10 minutes before he did. He came in breathless, like he had run instead of walked, and placed a folded scrap of paper on the counter along with his coins. Can you, is this enough for the coffee and also, could you maybe read that later? The scrap of paper said, in shaky letters. My name is Joseph. I think you are extraordinary. May I walk you home someday? We were so careful back then, so formal. Not like the way people talk now, all shorthand and screens. Words were heavier because you had to carry them all the way to someone's face. Did you ever get a note that made your whole day tilt, just a little? I wrote, yes, on the back of his scrap of paper and slipped it into his saucer when I brought his coffee. He looked up at me like I had just handed him a second heartbeat. That was the beginning. Now, in my lap, I untie the blue ribbon, and the letters bloom out like pale petals. The first one is dated June 3, 1958. The paper is lined and thin. There's a smudge where his hand caught the ink. I clear my throat and begin to read, not out loud. The words live in my memory so well I don't need to. Dear Margaret. Today you wore a yellow dress and laughed at something the baker said, and I thought, if I don't tell her how I feel, I will regret it the rest of my life. I hope this does not scare you. I only wanted you to know that your smile has become the best part of my mornings. He always wrote like that. A little clumsy, very earnest, never quite believing his luck that I would sit across from him, share half a cinnamon roll, and listen to him talk about books and plans and the way he wanted to see the ocean someday. He didn't know that, by the time he finally saw the ocean, everything between us would have changed. We courted in letters more than in person. His job at the factory meant long shifts, my mother's strict rules meant short evenings. He wrote from lunch breaks, from the edge of his narrow bed, from a bench in the park when the weather was kind. He wrote the way some people pray. I fold that first letter back along the lines it has always known and pick up another. This one is from the winter of '59. The corner is torn, like someone once opened it in a hurry. Dear Margaret. They say there may be layoffs. I am not afraid, as long as I still have your letters to come home to. Your words feel like the lamp in my mother's kitchen window. He talks about fear, but he jokes too, about the way oil never quite leaves his fingernails, about the older men at the factory who call him college boy for reading in the break room. I remember the night I wrote him back. Dear Joseph. If you lose your job, we will still have your hands and my stubbornness. Between the two, we'll manage somehow. I believe that. At 19, you think love plus willpower can hold up the whole sky. You don't yet understand how heavy the sky can be. The letters after that grow slower, more spaced out. Not because we loved each other less, but because life thickened between us. My father fell ill. My mother needed help. Joseph took every extra shift. We still walked together when we could, but often our romance had to live between envelopes. Then came the war. I watch your face now, or the camera lens, or whoever you are listening, and I can almost hear your thoughts. But Grandma, that's how all these old stories go. Boy goes to war, girl waits, letters carry their love until he comes back, limping but alive, and they marry and grow old on a porch swing. You think you know this story. You don't. Joseph did not go to war. He failed the medical exam because of a childhood fever that had left his heart with a slight murmur. He was furious and secretly relieved. We both were. Instead, he stayed and took over longer hours as the factory turned to making things for those who did go. The letters from that time are full of guilt he never needed to feel. Dear Margaret. I see the boys with their duffel bags at the station and feel like a coward in oil-stained boots. Sometimes I wrote back sharper than I should have. Dear Joseph. A coward doesn't show up every day to care for people at home. We were learning then, love is not only the sweet words, but also the rough ones you sand down later with apologies. But the hardest words were the ones neither of us knew how to write. He asked me to marry him in a letter. Not the way he meant to, but it happened that way. Dear Margaret. Yesterday Mrs. Lewis joked that if I don't marry you soon, she will find me a sensible girl who can bake. I told her you are sensible and can bake and that I would marry you tomorrow if I could. I read that line over and over until the paper began to fur at the creases. The next Sunday, when we met by the river, I brought the letter. My hands shook as I held it up. Did you mean it? I asked him. About tomorrow? His ears went red. I meant, someday soon. But if tomorrow is what you want, yes. We laughed, nervous, giddy. We weren't engaged yet, not really, but the idea sat between us like a third hand, warm and hopeful. That night, I wrote him a letter I never sent. Have you ever written something so true it scared you into silence? It's here, in this bundle. Different from the others because it has no stamp, no address. Just his name, in my careful handwriting. I slide it out. The paper is softer than the rest, the edge is more worn, because I have taken it out and read it on so many lonely nights. Dear Joseph. Yes. I want to marry you. Not someday, soon. The world feels too fragile to wait. I want your boots by my door and your books on my shelf and your name on my hand. It goes on. I pour out every dream, every fear. I confess how afraid I am of becoming my mother, bitter and tired. I tell him his laughter makes the weight of my father's illness feel lighter. And then, in the last line, I write the thing that freezes my pen. And if my father's health worsens, would you consider moving in with us, just for a while, so my mother is not alone? It was a reasonable question. Loving, practical. But in that one sentence, I was asking him to step into a life of caretaking and sacrifice at 21. I folded the letter. I addressed it. I even held it over the mailbox slot. And then I pulled it back. I didn't send it. That was my first almost choice. The first ghost in this trunk. Do you ever think about the lives we lose and the decisions we never quite make? Days later, before I could decide whether to show him the letter in person, everything changed. My father's illness took a sharp turn. There was a rush of white sheets and hospital corridors and forms to sign. Joseph knocked on our door with flowers and found only my mother's neighbor, who said, "They've gone to the hospital." He came, of course. He sat with me in the harsh fluorescent waiting room, his big hands swallowed by the plastic chair arms. He bought me bad coffee and worse sandwiches. My father died at dawn. I remember the pale blue of the hospital walls, the sound of the monitor flatlining, my mother's knees buckling. I remember Joseph's arm around my shoulders as if it had grown there. I also remember the envelope in my coat pocket, the unsent letter crinkling like a small, useless heart. In the weeks that followed, we were too busy surviving to dream. The funeral, the paperwork, the sudden hole in our income. Joseph took triple shifts. I quit the bakery to help my mother. We still wrote, but the words were about bills, about groceries, about exhaustion. The painting of our future together hung in the back of my mind, but slowly, another picture began to overlay it. My mother, sitting alone at the kitchen table. My mother, trying to lift pots too heavy for her. My mother, staring at the door that would close behind me if I left. One evening, Joseph and I sat on that same riverbank where we had talked about tomorrow. The water moved slower, somehow, weighed down by what we now knew about loss. He took my hand. "Margaret," he said, "as soon as things settle a bit, we'll set a date. I promise. We'll find a way. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just, together." I looked at him and saw everything we could have. I looked over his shoulder and saw my mother's empty chair. And I knew, with a cold, painful clarity, that life was asking me to choose. Not between love and duty, that would be too simple. Between two different kinds of love. That night, I wrote him another letter. This one I did send. Dear Joseph. I don't know how to say this without breaking both our hearts. I broke mine first, with every line. I told him my mother needed me. I told him I was afraid we would both drown in the weight of responsibility if I married him now. I told him he deserved someone whose hands were free to build a new home, not someone whose hands were tied to an old one. I told him I loved him too much to ask him to wait in uncertainty. It was a noble-sounding letter. It was also, if I'm honest, threaded with fear. Fear of poverty, of resentment, of watching him grow tired and distant under the strain. When I dropped that letter into the mailbox, it felt like dropping a stone into a well so deep I'd never hear it hit the bottom. Have you ever done something that was both right and unbearable? His reply came days later. 1 envelope. 4 pages. Tear stains I pretended not to see. Dear Margaret. I would have waited. I would have carried any weight with you. But if this is the path you have chosen, I will not stand in your way. The last lines are the ones that decades have not managed to blur. I will not write again. Not because I do not love you, but because I do. And I think the kindest thing for both of us is to let this be the ending, not a wound we keep reopening. He kept his promise. That was the last letter. Except it wasn't quite the end. Here, near the bottom of the bundle, is one more envelope. Different paper. Different handwriting, shakier. Postmarked 10 years later. I almost didn't put it in the trunk. I almost burned it. Do you want to know what it says? I hesitate, fingers resting on the flap. Even now, after all these years, Joseph's ghost has a way of looking over my shoulder when I read his words. The envelope is addressed to Mrs. Margaret Holloway. That was my name after I married your grandfather. Yes. I married someone else. You know that part. You knew my husband as Grandpa, the man who fixed your toys and fell asleep with the news on. You didn't know that, before we married, I stood on a different shore and almost boarded a different ship. The last letter came on a Tuesday. I had been married for 8 years. Your mother was 6. The house smelled like crayons and laundry and something burning in the oven. I almost threw the envelope away without opening it. The return address said Joseph Carter, and for a second the room tilted, time folding in on itself. Then I shut the kitchen door, leaned against the counter, and slid my thumb under the flap. Inside was 1 page. The handwriting was weaker but still undeniably his. Dear Margaret. I hope this finds you well. I heard from an old neighbor that you married and have a little girl. I'm glad. Truly. You never owed me a life, only the shared piece of time we had. I'm writing because I'm sick now. The doctors say it's not the kind that mends. I find myself thinking about unfinished stories. I wanted you to know that I never regretted loving you. Not for a single day. If you ever think of me, I hope it is with kindness, not with the heavy, what if, that people write novels about. I sat on the floor and cried like a woman twice my age and half my age, all at once. I never wrote back. What could I say? I'm sorry I chose the life I did, even though it brought me my children. Thank you for letting me break your heart. Sometimes silence is cowardice. Sometimes it is mercy. I still don't know which that silence was. I refold the letter and place it back in the stack. The blue ribbon goes around them again, tying our 19-year-old selves together for the 1000th time. I want you to understand something. Your grandfather was a good man. A kind man. I grew to love him in a quieter, steadier way than the wild ache of first love. He knew about Joseph. Not all the details, but enough. He knew there was a boy from the bakery who had once held my heart with ink-stained fingers. He also knew I chose him. Every morning. Every night I lay down next to him and listened to his snoring and thought, this is my life, and I'm glad. Love is not always fireworks. Sometimes it's a lamp left on in the hallway so you don't trip at 2 a.m. We build our lives from both the loves we keep and the loves we release. But this trunk does not only hold the stories of the loves I kept. I lay the letters gently back into the trunk, their weight familiar now against my palms. Beneath them is a small, flat object wrapped in tissue paper. I know what it is without unwrapping it, a pressed daisy from a picnic with your grandfather, a movie ticket from the first film I ever saw in color, a church program from the Sunday your mother sang in the choir for the first time. Little proof slips of a life lived in ordinary joys. I smile at them and let them be. Tonight, there isn't enough time for every small happiness. Tonight is for the bigger ghosts. My fingers touch something else next, stiff leather, rough with age. I pull it out. A pair of tiny baby shoes. White once, now the color of old cream, with little scuffs on the toes and soft creases where a foot once curled. People always coo over baby shoes in shops. Oh, they're so small, they say, their voices going up an octave. But these shoes have never made anyone coo. Because no one has seen them but me. Do you know whose feet wore these shoes? You might assume they were your mother's, or your uncle's. They weren't. These belonged to a child who never made it into family stories. A child who existed between breaths, between the pages of our photo albums. A child named Thomas. I trace the edge of one shoe with my thumb. The leather is cool and smooth. Your grandfather and I married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. No white dress, no organ music. Just the two of us, my mother and his parents, a judge who had somewhere else to be. We went home afterward to a pot roast my mother overcooked from nerves. We were poor, but we were warm. We had one bedroom and a crib my brother-in-law built from old wood. We had hopes that hung from the ceiling like invisible decorations. When I found out I was pregnant, I told your grandfather by placing these shoes on his dinner plate. He came home from the factory, smelling of metal and sweat, humming something off-key. Sat down, unfolded his napkin, and froze. "What's this?" he asked, voice already breaking. "You should probably know," I said, trying to sound casual, "your feet are about to be out-cued in this house." He laughed, that deep, surprised laugh I loved, and scooped me up, and we spun around the kitchen until I begged him to stop before we both threw up. We named the lump in my belly Peanut, until the doctor told us boy and due in March. That's when we whispered Thomas to each other in the dark. After your grandfather's favorite uncle, who had once snuck him into a baseball game. We bought almost nothing. We couldn't afford it. But one day, when we were in town to buy flour and soap, I saw these shoes in a shop window. They were too nice for us. Brand new, soft, with little laces that definitely cost more than my worn-out shoes. I stood there, staring, fingers digging into the coins in my pocket. Your grandfather followed my gaze. "We can't," he said gently. "I know," I said. We walked another block. Then he stopped, turned around, and marched back to the shop. "Sometimes," he said, "a man has to be foolish on purpose." He worked an extra Saturday shift to make up for it. We kept those shoes on the dresser, right next to my side of the bed. At night, I would lie there and imagine the sound they'd make on the floor, the patter of tiny steps, the way they would dangle from chubby feet while we tried to wrangle Thomas into his Sunday best. My pregnancy was easy, at first. A little nausea, a lot of backache, but nothing alarming. I sang while I washed dishes. Your grandfather painted the crib yellow, the only color we had enough paint for. And then, at 7 months, everything went wrong. Have you ever felt your body betray you, as if it had been keeping a cruel secret? I remember the day it started. I was hanging laundry in the backyard, white shirts flapping like flags. The sky was a flat gray, heavy. I felt a sharp pain in my lower belly, so sudden it knocked the clothespin from my fingers. I tried to shake it off. Pregnant women always have pains, right? That's what the older women at church said. But then I felt something else. A wet warmth between my legs. I looked down and saw red blooming on my dress. The world narrowed to that color. I don't remember how I got to the hospital. I know your grandfather carried me at one point, his breath coming in ragged gasps, muttering, hold on, like he could bargain with the universe. I remember the bright lights, the smell of antiseptic, a nurse's brisk voice, the word early, the word complications, the word try. They tried. They really did. So did I. Hours blurred into a kind of white noise of pain and fear. At some point, there was a cry. Thin. Brief. And then nothing. When I woke fully, my arms were empty. My belly felt strangely flat and sore. Where's my baby? I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. The nurse looked at the doctor. The doctor looked at the floor. I'm so sorry, he said. He was too small, Mrs. Holloway. His lungs, he didn't have a chance. Didn't have a chance. As if life were a game, and my son had been benched before he even knew the rules. They offered to bring him to me, wrapped in a blanket, so I could see him, say goodbye. I couldn't. I didn't say that out loud. I just turned my face to the wall and sobbed until my throat burned. Later, I hated myself for that. For not wanting to see his face, even once. Do you think less of me for that? Your grandfather held him. I know that now. He told me years later, when the grief had softened at the edges. He said he looked like a bird fallen from the nest, too fragile for this place. He whispered, I'm sorry, son, and kissed his forehead. The hospital took care of everything else. That's what they said. Took care. Like he was a problem to solve. When we came home, the house felt wrong. Too quiet. The yellow crib was an accusation in the corner. The shoes on the dresser might as well have been knives. We packed the few baby things we had into a box, the blanket, the little hat your mother knitted with uneven stitches, the diaper pins that still looked too big. I held the shoes the longest. Maybe we should give them away, your grandfather said softly. To someone who needs them. I shook my head. Then what should we do? I didn't have an answer. So I did what I've always done with things too painful to face head on. I put them in this trunk. Every year, for a long time, I would take them out on March 14th, the day he should have been born. I would hold them, run my fingers along the creases where his feet never pressed, and imagine the life that should have filled them. I imagined Thomas at 5, tracking mud through the kitchen, at 10, climbing trees, at 16, slamming doors, at 20, leaving for wherever boys with restless hearts go. Instead, he is forever the weight that never settled in my arms. We did not talk about him much, your grandfather and I. Not because we didn't care, but because the words caught in our throats. People say mourning gets easier with time. That's not quite true. It gets quieter. It moves from the front of the shelf to the back. But every so often, when you reach for something else, your fingers brush it and the dust flies up in your face and you can't see for a while. There is a part of this story I have never told anyone. After Thomas, I was terrified to try again. For a year we lived in a kind of careful truce with my body. Then, one late summer afternoon, I was washing dishes when I felt a familiar roll in my stomach. Not the sharp pains of loss, but a slow, unmistakable flutter. When the doctor confirmed it, pregnant, I didn't tell your grandfather right away. I told Thomas. I sat on the edge of our bed, shoes in my lap, and whispered, "You're going to be a big brother." I know that sounds strange. Maybe even morbid. But grief makes you build little altars in your heart. And on mine, in that moment, I placed a promise: I will not forget you, even as I move forward. Your mother was born on a cold day in February. Healthy lungs. Loud cry. Pink fist wrapped around my finger like she intended to drag me through life. In the joy of her, people forgot the shadow that had come before. That's what people do. They decorate over cracks. But under our joy, under our laughter when she said her first word and took her first step, Thomas was there. Not in a sad way, always. Sometimes in a gentle way. A reminder to be grateful, to hold her a little longer. These shoes are not just about loss. They are about what loss taught me, how to love the children who did arrive with both hands open. Every life we lose quietly teaches us how fiercely to love the ones we keep. I placed the shoes back in the trunk, my fingers lingering for a second. You might think that is the heaviest thing in this box. It's not. Beneath a folded flannel shirt and a tin of old buttons lies cloth unlike anything else in here. Softer, with a pattern almost eroded by time. I pull it out, and the room seems to tilt back 50 years. It's a dress. Once, it was a rich deep blue, with tiny white flowers scattered across it like stars. Now it's more of a faded storm color, edges frayed, the fabric thinned at the seams. The neckline is modest. The waist is cinched by darts my mother sewed herself. This is the dress I wore the day I stopped being my mother's daughter and started being my own woman. People call it a traditional dress now, something quaint and old-fashioned. When I was young, it was just a dress you wore when you wanted your elders to stop fussing about your shoulders showing. My mother made it from a pattern she had used for years. She stood behind me with pins in her mouth, muttering as she tugged the fabric this way and that. Stand up straight, Margaret. No man wants to marry a question mark. Ma, I'd groan. What? It's true. You bend yourself now, you'll stay bent. She meant well. It was her way of giving advice, sharp, practical, laced with worry she never admitted. The day she finished the dress, she made me twirl in front of the cracked mirror. You look respectable, she said, which was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. I didn't want to look respectable. I wanted to look like the girls in magazines, waist smaller, hair glossier, future clearer. But the first time I wore this dress out of the house, I realized something important. Respectable can be its own kind of brave. Have you ever worn something that felt like armor, even though it was made of cotton? I wore the dress to church, mostly. Weddings, funerals, any event where the older women sat in the back pew, whispering and watching. But the day I remember most clearly is the day I wore it to tell my mother I was leaving home. It was the summer after we lost Thomas, before your mother was born. I had been living with my mother and your grandfather, helping them, still the good daughter who came home every evening. One hot afternoon, sweat prickling the back of my neck, I looked around the tiny kitchen where I had grown up. The same faded curtains. The same chips in the counter where my father had once set down a pot too hard. And I felt something pressing at my ribs. A sense that if I did not move, did not loosen the ties that bound me to this house, I would suffocate under the weight of everyone else's needs. Grief can tie you to people. It can also trap you. Your grandfather, then still just Holloway, to my mother, had been patient. He had waited through Thomas. He had held me through sleepless nights. He had not pushed when I said, I need to be here with Ma. But one evening, as we sat on that same riverbank where so many of my life's crossroads seemed to appear, he said quietly, Margaret, we can't wait forever. He was right. So, the next morning, I put on this dress. I braided my hair like my mother liked it. I walked into the kitchen, where she was kneading bread, her hands deep in dough. Ma, I said. I'm going to marry Holloway. Her hands stilled. Flour dusted the air between us. Is that so? She said. Her voice was flat, carefully blank. Yes. When? In the fall. I'll be moving out. There it was. The real sentence hidden in the polite one. She resumed kneading, her fingers working the dough harder than necessary. You think I can't manage without you, she said eventually. That I'll fall apart like one of those cakes you bake without measuring. That's not. I survived the depression. I buried a husband. I've watched men come back from war with half their minds. Don't you dare act like I'll die if you go live your life. Her words stung because they were a shield for something softer, fear. I stepped closer, the hem of my dress brushing the worn linoleum. It's not that I think you can't manage, I said. It's that I need to try managing my own life too. I can't be just a daughter forever. The room buzzed with silence. Your father always said, she muttered, more to the dough than to me, a girl's first duty is to her family. I am starting a family, I said. My voice shook, but I kept going. Holloway is my family now. And one day our children will be. I have to be there, Ma. Fully. Not with half my heart still in this kitchen. Her shoulders sagged. For a second, she looked very small to me. Not the towering figure of my childhood, but a woman whose own dreams had been set aside when her mother got sick, when her siblings needed help, when my father lost his job. I realized then that she wasn't only angry at me. She was angry at every moment life had told her, not for you. Not now. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face me. You'll understand when you're my age, she said. I hope I don't, I replied before I could swallow the words. Have you ever loved someone and still known you must disappoint them to stay true to yourself? Her eyes flashed. Then they filled with tears. Go then, she said. Marry your man. Wear your pretty dress. But don't come crying back here when it's harder than you think. We both knew I would come back, not to cry, but to visit, to help, to bring grandchildren. But we needed this fierce scene. It was how women like us said goodbye to one chapter and hello to another. On my wedding day, not the courthouse one, but the little church blessing we did afterward for her sake, I wore this dress again. Not white, not lacy, but mine. My mother fixed the collar 3 times. She kissed my cheek like she was sending a soldier to the front. You stand up straight, you hear, she whispered. Don't you bend. I think, in her own stubborn way, she was blessing me. Years later, when she grew too frail to live alone, she moved in with us. I wore this dress to pick her up from the bus stop. She looked me up and down. Still respectable, she said. You did all right. She died in our guest room, with your mother reading to her from a romance novel and your grandfather snoring in the armchair. After the funeral, I folded this dress and placed it in the trunk. I kept it not because it was pretty, but because it was the cloth version of a sentence, I chose my own life. But there's something else about this dress. Something I have never said out loud. On the inside hem, in tiny stitches only I know to look for, are 3 initials. Not mine. Not your grandfather's. J.C. Joseph Carter. I stitched them there the night before I told my mother I was leaving. Why? Because I needed to remember the girl I had been when I loved him. I needed a reminder that I was capable of choosing, of breaking my own heart and still moving forward. I didn't marry Joseph. But the courage I found when I let him go, that courage walked into the kitchen with me that day in this dress. I sewed his initials where only I would see them, like a secret spine. Have you ever carried a past love like a hidden thread through your present? I turned the hem so you can imagine the tiny letters, almost invisible now. Then I fold the dress and lay it back in the trunk. We have opened 3 doors tonight. The first love I let go. The child who never came home. The day I chose a life that was partly mine, not just everyone else's. But there is still one thing left in this trunk that I have never, ever shared. It is wrapped in brown paper at the very bottom, under the quilt, under the letters, under the shoes, under the dress. I have moved that small bundle from house to house for more than 50 years, telling myself that someday I would burn it, or bury it, or at least look at it without feeling my throat close. I never did. Tonight, I will. Before I reach for it, let me say this, every family has missing pieces. Stories that don't quite line up. Names that are whispered once and then left to fade. Maybe you felt that, a sense that there's a room in your family house that's always kept locked. This bundle is that room, for us. And I am about to open the door. My hand trembles as it crosses the trunk. These are not the tremors of age. This is an old, familiar shaking, the body remembering what the mind tried to forget. My fingers brush the paper. It crackles softly. The bundle is not very big. About the size of a hardcover book. The paper is yellowed, the string around it thin as a vein. I lift it out and rest it on my knees. For a moment, I consider stopping. I could shut the lid. I could leave this one story buried with me. But secrets are like seeds, you know. They don't stay small. They send roots through generations. Do I want our family, to keep tripping over roots you can't see? No. So I untie the string. The paper falls open. Inside is a folder from a county office, brittle and brown. On the tab, in faded type, is my name. And under it, another name. Baby girl Harper. The year is 1956. You're doing the math in your head now, aren't you? Yes. This was before Thomas. Before your mother. Before I married your grandfather. This is the secret, before any of you, I had a daughter I gave away. Do you hate me yet? I didn't know I was pregnant. That's what girls always say, isn't it? But it was true. I was young. It was before Joseph, before Holloway. I was working at the bakery, taking care of my father, drowning in responsibility and too naive to understand my own body fully. Her father. I hesitate, even now. It feels disloyal to give him a name, when he never claimed her. He was a boy from the neighborhood. Charming in a careless way. He made me feel seen when I was invisible, fetching tea and carrying laundry. We weren't in love. Not really. I mistook attention for affection. I mistook flattery for commitment. One night, after too much cheap beer at a friend's kitchen table during a birthday gathering, lines blurred. Hands wandered. I said no once. Then I didn't say it again. Part 59. Was it my fault? Was it his? In those days, girls like me were taught to shoulder the shame regardless. Months later, my dresses grew tighter. I told myself it was the bakery pastries. I worked more hours to distract myself. By the time I couldn't ignore it, by the time I fainted in the middle of frosting a cake and woke up in a clinic, I was 6 months along. Have you ever had your future rewritten in a single sentence? The nurse's face was kind but firm. Miss Harper, she said, Harper was my maiden name, you're carrying a child. Part 60. I laughed. I actually laughed. Then I cried until she patted my shoulder and brought me a glass of water. At home, I stared at myself in the mirror, seeing a stranger. A mother. In that moment, motherhood didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a verdict. My family was barely holding together. My father's heart was already failing. My mother was working herself thin. If I showed up with a belly and no husband, everything would unravel. The boy, let's call him David, wanted to disappear. I can marry you, he stammered when I told him. But I don't, I'm leaving for work out west. Anne. I don't know, Margaret. Are you sure? No, I wasn't sure. Of anything. I visited a home for unwed mothers, the kind of place people whispered about. It smelled like bleach and desperation. Girls with swollen stomachs and hollow eyes shuffled through corridors, knitting tiny hats for babies they wouldn't keep. I signed papers I barely read. Words like temporary custody and adoption floated past me like leaves in a storm. Are you certain? The woman with the clipboard asked. No, I said honestly. She frowned. But you're signing anyway? Yes. Why? Because our tiny kitchen couldn't hold another body. Because my mother's disappointment would crush me. Because I didn't believe I could love a child without breaking under the weight of it. Because I was young and scared and alone. All of those truths lived in my throat. None of them made it past my lips. I just am, I whispered. The day I gave birth, it was raining. Of course it was. I labored in a narrow bed, the smell of disinfectant crawling up my nose. There was no husband's hand to grip, no mother's soothing voice. Just the nurse and the doctor and the hard metal stirring of instruments. When my daughter finally slid into the world, she cried loudly. Angrily. As if she already sensed the unfairness of her first day. Do you want to hold her? The nurse asked. I hesitated. Yes, I said. She was warm. Heavier than I expected and so very small. Dark hair glued to her scalp in tiny curls. Eyes squeezed shut, mouth open in a wail that sounded like a question. What's her name? The nurse asked. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I had been so busy trying not to imagine her future that I had never given her a name. Baby girl Harper, the nurse wrote on a form. I held her for less than an hour. Then a woman in a gray suit came, smiled too brightly, and gently took her from my arms. You're doing the right thing, she said. She'll have a good life. How do you know? I asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. People like her never do. They left. The silence after a baby's cry stops is worse than the loudest noise you can imagine. It settles on your chest like wet wool. I went home the next day with no baby and a flat stomach that felt like a lie. My mother asked where I had been. I said at a friend's. She scolded me for staying out all night. I took the scolding gladly. It was a punishment I could understand. For weeks, I woke up at night, certain I heard a baby crying in another room. I'd stumble out of bed, heart racing, and find nothing but shadows. Do you know what it's like to grieve someone you're not allowed to mention? A year later, a letter arrived from the agency. It was thin, impersonal. Baby girl Harper has been placed with a suitable family. They have renamed her Emily. She is healthy and thriving. I pressed my face to that paper and sobbed. Emily. She had a name now. A life without me. I had no right to feel jealous. No right to feel anything but relieved. That was the story, anyway. That was what the world told girls like me. Move on. Be grateful. Forget. I could not forget. So I did the only thing I knew how to do when faced with something too big for my daily life. I folded the letter. I kept the hospital bracelet with Baby Girl Harper stamped in cheap metal. I kept the paper with her tiny inky footprints, dark smudges on white. I put them in this folder. And then I put the folder in this trunk. Years passed. I met Joseph. I broke with Joseph. I married your grandfather. I lost Thomas. I had your mother and your uncle. I bounced babies on my hip. I packed school lunches. I worked, I cooked, I laughed, I worried. All the while, there was another child out there. A girl turning 3, 5, 12, 20. On her birthday, not the exact date, I never knew it, just the month they told me, I would sit by the window and imagine her somewhere, blowing out candles. Did she like books? Did she hate green beans? Did she ever look in the mirror and wonder where her nose came from? I never told your grandfather. This is the part that hurts to admit. He knew about Joseph. He knew about Thomas. He did not know about Emily. Why? Because by the time we married, that story felt like a different lifetime. And because, deep down, I was afraid he would look at me differently. See me not as the quiet, responsible girl from the bakery, but as the foolish young woman who had made a choice she could never undo. I told myself I was protecting him from pain. That it would only open old wounds. But if I'm honest, I was protecting myself from judgment. So I carried Emily alone. Not her, of course. She belonged to another family. But the idea of her. The knowledge that somewhere out there walked a young woman with my eyes or my hands, who did not know my name. Once, when your mother was in high school, we were watching a talk show where a woman reunited with the child she had given up for adoption. Your mother sniffed and said, I could never do that. Give up my own baby. How could anyone? I felt like the floor had tilted under my chair. I opened my mouth to speak. To say, sometimes love looks like letting go, even when it breaks you. But the moment passed. The commercial came on. Dinner burned in the oven. Life, as it always does, interrupted confession. So I stayed silent. Do you see how secrets grow? Not in big, dramatic choices, but in tiny hesitations. In the words we almost say. I followed Emily's ghost quietly. Once, I wrote to the agency. Is she okay? I asked. Can you tell me anything? They sent back a polite note. She is well. She is in school. She is thriving. That is all we can tell you. I folded that letter and added it to this folder. As the years went on, the ache changed shape. When your mother graduated, I thought, somewhere, Emily may be in a cap and gown too. When your uncle married, I thought, maybe she's walking down an aisle somewhere, arm in arm with someone who feels like home. When you were born, when I held you and counted your toes, I thought, I have held 3 generations in my arms, but there is still one child I never got to rock to sleep. Do you think I don't have the right to call her mine? Maybe I don't. But right or not, she has always been part of my heart's landscape. There is one more page in this folder. One I did not expect to find, years after I thought the story was finished. 10 years ago, yes, that recently, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was careful, almost formal. Inside was a single page. Dear Mrs. Harper, if that is still your name. I am writing in the hope that you are the Margaret Harper who, in 1956, gave birth to a baby girl that was later adopted. I grew up knowing I was adopted. When I turned 40, I decided to look into my records. They were vague, but there was enough there to find your name. I don't want to disrupt your life. I don't even know if you want to hear from me. I just wanted to say thank you. I have had a good life. 2 parents who loved me, a brother who teased me, a career that fulfills me. I am not writing to ask why. I can imagine 1,000 reasons, and I don't need any of them to know that you made a hard choice. If you ever want to write back, here is a P.O. box. If not, please know I hold no anger toward you. Only gratitude for the life you gave me. Sincerely, Emily. Emily. Seeing her name, chosen by someone else, in her own hand, nearly stopped my heart. I sat at this very table, I can see the ring from my teacup still on the wood, and stared at that letter for an hour. I should have written back. Every sensible part of me knows that. I should have written, I have thought of you every year. I am so glad you are well. I am sorry. I am grateful. I am terrified. But I didn't. Why? Because by then, your grandfather was ill. Because your mother's marriage was unraveling. Because it felt selfish to open a new, emotional chapter when the existing ones were already frayed. Because I was afraid you would all see me through a new lens. Because I was a coward. I folded Emily's letter. I placed it in this folder. I put the folder back in the trunk. And I have regretted that silence every day since. Do you know what the heaviest kind of regret is? The kind that comes from kindness you didn't give, not cruelty you did. I don't know if that P.O. box is still hers. I don't know if she is still waiting, or if she decided my silence was its own answer. I do know this, if she ever sees this, if she ever hears these words, I want her to know, I am sorry. I was young and scared when I let you go. I was older and just as scared when I stayed silent. You were never unwanted. You were, in fact, so wanted I believed you deserved a life I didn't know how to give. Maybe that was arrogant. Maybe that was wrong. But it was never indifference. I fold the folder closed one more time. Then, slowly, I place it back in the trunk. I sit there for a long moment, my hands resting on the edge of the open lid. We have walked through a lifetime together tonight, haven't we? From the girl in the bakery with ink-stained love letters, to the young woman in a borrowed clinic bed, to the mother with empty arms, to the wife standing in a faded dress telling her own mother, I have to go, to the grandmother sitting here now, with a heart full of names. Do you see your grandmother differently now? Maybe you feel sorry for me. Maybe you feel angry. Maybe you feel surprised that quiet, apron-wearing, cookie-baking me ever made choices like these. I don't need you to think I was right. I only need you to understand that I was human. We like to think of our elders as fixed points. Rocks. But we were rivers once. We carved our own paths. Sometimes we flooded the wrong banks. I look into the trunk one last time. The letters. The shoes. The dress. The folder. Every object has done its work tonight. Now I have one more task. I reach under my chair and pull out a small handheld camera. Your cousin set it up for me last Christmas, so you can tell us stories, he said. I laughed and put it in a drawer. Tonight, I finally turned it on. If you are watching this, it means I am probably gone. Or too tired to tell these stories with my own breath. Maybe you found the trunk while cleaning out my room. Maybe you hesitated before opening it, the way I always did. Maybe you heard my voice in your head saying, "Be careful with old things, they break." I want you to open it anyway. I want you to take out each object and remember not just these stories, but your own. Do you have a drawer full of ticket stubs and concert wristbands? Do you have screenshots of texts you couldn't bear to delete? Do you have a sweater that still smells faintly of someone you lost? That's your trunk. Don't wait until you are my age, with doctors telling you to get your affairs in order, to open it. Tell your stories now. To your children, to your friends, to yourself in a notebook no one else will ever read. Because here is what I have learned, sitting in the dust of my old days. The things we hide to protect others often end up chaining us instead. I close the trunk lid halfway, then pause. There is one more thing I want to say. To Joseph, I loved you. I let you go. I carry your letters not as a sign of disloyalty to my husband, but as a monument to the girl I was with you. I hope, wherever you are, you understand. To Thomas, I am sorry I never saw your face. I am sorry fear kept me from holding you. You taught me that love can exist for someone whose hand you never held. To my mother, you were harder on me than you needed to be, and softer on me than you ever admitted. I understand now the tightrope you walked between duty and self. To Emily, if life is kind, maybe you will never see this, because it means you never had need to search for me. But if you do, know this, you have always been a part of my prayers, even when my lips did not speak your name. To my children, and to you, my grandchild, my listener, you were not born into a family of perfect people. You were born into a family of survivors. Of women who made impossible choices and kept going anyway. You do not have to repeat our secrets to honor our strength. Take what is good. Leave what is broken. Build something better. I finally lower the lid. For the first time, instead of sliding the trunk back under the bed, I leave it out. Let them see it, I whisper to no one and everyone. Let them open it if they want. I turn back to the camera, to you. If any part of my story has touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own grandmother, or your own hidden trunk, will you do something for me? Press that little like button. Not for the numbers, but as a tiny way of saying, these stories matter. It helps more people find this corner of the internet where old memories still have a place to breathe. And it helps keep this channel, Dust of Old Days, alive so more stories like this can be told. And if you want to sit with more long, slow, honest stories, of love and loss and the small objects that hold entire lives, please subscribe to Dust of Old Days. Think of it as adding one more room to your own house of memories. A room where you can visit whenever the present feels too loud, and let the past speak for a while. Before we part, I want to ask you something. When you're gone, what will be in the trunk under your bed? Will it be full of unsent letters and unworn shoes? Or will it be full of things that remind the people you love of a life lived wide open? You still have time to decide. I am almost out of time. But tonight, at least, I have opened my trunk. I have let the dust rise. I have let you see not just your grandmother, but the girl, the woman, the mother, the flawed, soft-hearted human I was. If you carry anything away from this, let it be this. Do not be afraid to tell the truth about your heart. Even if your voice trembles. Even if your hands shake over an old wooden trunk. Even if you think it's too late. Somewhere, someone you love is waiting to understand you better. Don't make them wait forever. Thank you for listening.